Grayscale project, drawing the grayscale. You'll need several supplies for this project. For drawing the grayscale, you'll only need a few. Your grayscale will need to be on a 14 by 8.5 sheet of paper, but you'll be starting with a 14 by 17 sheet, so it will need to be cut in half. Since the shorter side of the paper is already 14 inches, you'll be dividing the paper horizontally at 8.5 inches to achieve the correct size. Now, let's turn that mark into a guideline for cutting. To be sure that it's straight, I'll use the T-square. Let the paper and the T of the ruler hang off the side of the table. You can use the edge of the table to brace the ruler against, but what's really important is that the paper is flat against the edge of the T-square. Now you're ready to cut the paper. Be sure not to cut directly on a surface that can be damaged. The cardboard backing of a drawing pad is the perfect surface. Press hard on the ruler with your non-dominant hand to hold it in place. Don't worry so much about pressing hard with the X-Acto knife. Keep the ruler and your hand pressed in place until you've confirmed you have cut all the way through the paper. Assuming they're the same size, we're ready to draw the grayscale. But before you put your X-Acto knife and ruler away, grab an extra piece of Bristol board and use it to cut several test strips. We'll use this for color and value mixing in the next couple of projects. To plot out the grayscale, we'll need to center a 2 by 10 inch rectangle on the 8.5 by 14 sheet of Bristol board, and then divide it into 10-inch strips for the 10 value steps. I like to do my measuring from the center out rather than from the outside in. I do this because if there are any discrepancies in the size of the paper, that error happens on the outside of the paper where it doesn't matter so much, instead of leaving me with a grayscale that isn't 2 inches wide or 10 inches tall. My first step will be to draw the longest sides of the grayscale. I'll do this by finding the center of the paper and then measuring 1 inch to the left and 1 inch to the right for a 2 inch wide grayscale. The shorter side of the paper is 8.5 inches. Half of this is 4¼ inches. If you struggle with rulers or fractions, a workaround to this could be using a long strip of paper, marking the distance you want to divide in half, and then folding the paper so that the crease reveals your center or halfway point. Now that I've found halfway, I can find the outside edges of the grayscale by measuring 1 inch out from the left and right to give me the 2 inch width of the grayscale. So from the halfway point, I can make a mark at 3¼ inches and 5¼ inches to give me the 2 inch width. Again, if you're uncomfortable with rulers or fractions, just slide the ruler over to an even number. I've slid the ruler over to the number 4, so I'll need a mark at 5 and at 3 to give me that 2 inches. These two marks indicate the width of the grayscale. To show its height, I'll extend these marks using the T-square. Since I haven't yet made marks to indicate the top and bottom of the grayscale, I'll draw these lines longer than I think I need. So now that I have the two lines drawn, I'll confirm that they're parallel by measuring 2 inches at the top and 2 inches at the bottom. Now for those lines that indicate the top and bottom of the grayscale. Again, we'll need to find the center, but vertically this time. So on a 14-inch tall sheet of paper, 7 inches will be the halfway mark. From there, you would need to measure 5 inches up and 5 inches down for the 10-inch total of the grayscale. You can see me doing this by subtracting 5 inches from the 7-inch mark to put a mark at 2 inches and adding 5 to 7 to put a mark at 12 inches on the ruler. I'll confirm my measurements by sliding my ruler to a more even number. It's hard for you to see, but the bottom mark lines up with the 10 and the top mark with the 20. Now I'll make a mark at every inch between those marks, indicating divisions for all 10 steps of the grayscale. Finally, I'll need to connect all of those marks to finish out the grayscale. I've taken a great deal of time to make sure each of these lines is perfectly straight. I've switched to a higher contrast background so you can see how carefully I'm lining up the top edge of this triangle with the edge of the paper. I can rely on the right triangle to make sure all of these lines are perfectly straight and parallel to each other. Now you've finished your grayscale. All that's left to do is check your measurements one last time. Making sure that the height of your grayscale is 10 inches with 1-inch divisions and that the width of the grayscale is 2 inches wide. Erase any extra marks and now you're ready to paint. Grayscale project, mixing and matching values. As you set up for the painting portion of this project, you'll need to gather your painting supplies. In a previous demonstration, we drew out the 2 by 10 inch grayscale divided into 10 equal steps. Now we'll be using this grayscale as a guide to paint in a grayscale that transitions from white to black in 10% increments. Let's start by painting in the black and white rectangles in the grayscale. You should use artist tape, masking tape, painter's tape, or some other low adhesive tape to mask off the area you'd like to paint. As you apply the tape, leave the parts of the tape that you won't be painting against loose, but make sure to really press on the side that will be painted against. This ensures that no paint will seep under the tape edges while you're painting. To set up the palette, scoop or squeeze your black and white paint into opposite corners of the palette paper. I'm using gray palette paper here, but white is also perfectly acceptable. Leaving the sheets of palette paper attached to the pad while you're mixing will keep the paper from sliding around on you. Now you're ready to paint. Evenly apply the paint in one direction to the entirety of the rectangle. Start and finish your brush stroke on the tape. This ensures the even texture of your paint as it dries. Wipe any excess paint on a paper towel. Between painting, thoroughly rinse your brush in a jar of water or better yet, under the sink. Rinse it until the water coming from the bristles is clean when pressed against a dry paper towel. Repeat the same process with the black paint, making sure to paint past the edges of the tape, and then thoroughly washing your brush when you're finished. Once you've finished painting, peel off the tape right away. Don't wait. Waiting gives the paint a chance to dry, and as it dries, it may adhere better to the surface of the tape than it does to the paper. In this case, you'll actually wind up tearing the paint from the paper as you remove it. You can see as the tape is peeled away what clean edges it reveals on your grayscale. Just a quick note on your choice of black paint. You were able to choose from Ivory or Mars Black in your supply list. In previous semesters, I have found that Ivory Black tends to be slightly warmer and therefore a better match when we are mixing and matching against the grayscale. I find that Mars Black will typically have a cooler, more bluish tone, making the values you mix appear to have just enough color in them to cause frustration for some students. Frustratingly for me, when I mixed up grays from these two blacks to show you, the Ivory Black appeared to be the bluer or cooler of the two. Perhaps this is accounted for by a change in paint brands from previous years, but regardless, it is something that many of you are going to notice going forward in this project, so I wanted to give you a heads up. As you begin mixing values, I recommend starting in the middle of your grayscale and jumping around. This gives the paint time to dry on other areas of the grayscale, but also keeps you more objective and sensitive to value changes. I'm starting with the 5th value down from white. That's value 6 on the grayscale. I'll start by mixing a bit of black and white paint together. You should never, ever, ever use your paintbrush to mix paint. As the paint blends together, I notice that I've got a value much darker than the value 6 that I'm shooting for. Comparing value 6 to the value of the palette paper, you can see that it is lighter than the palette paper. This gives me a mark to shoot for. I have the value of the palette paper all around the paint I'm mixing, so I know I need a value at least as light as that before I'm getting close. This is feeling better. I'm starting to see the value of the paint actually disappear into the palette paper. I'm continuing to mix and wipe my palette knife against the palette paper. This is to ensure that there are no small amounts of pure black or pure white that will surprise me later when I go to paint the mixture. At this point, I've matched the value of the palette paper pretty well, but you can see that value 6 is still much lighter than this. After making the value a bit lighter, I'll use one of our pre-cut test strips to help me visualize even better how close or far away I am from the correct value. This value is still way too dark. It even seems too dark for value 5 on the grayscale. It's falling somewhere between value 5 and value 4, so I know I'm going to have to go lighter. I like comparing the value I've mixed to values above and below the value I'm actually shooting for. This is a good way to keep yourself objective when comparing values with such subtle differences. I'll add more white and then check the mixture again on the test strip. I like the test strips because they give you the closest possible comparison between the paint that you've mixed and the grayscale. You can lay the value right up against the value that you're aiming for. I'm liking this value much better. It feels too dark to be the value above and too light to be the value below. Further comparisons you can make are squinting as you look at the two values next to each other. This will help cancel out any temperature difference and help you really see the value. Another great way to help train your eye to see value is to use your smartphone as a tool to desaturate the image. Start by taking a picture of the two values you want to compare. Zoom in as much as possible, even if the camera loses focus a little bit. Tilt and turn the paint strip until you're sure there is no glare, then take the picture. Open it in the picture gallery and select Edit. Then, under the adjustment dial, which is already selected for you, scroll across to saturation and then drag to 0. From here, these values look like a pretty good match. Compare this to the color version and you can see how this tool might be helpful to you. So I'll paint this value in for the value 6 on the grayscale. Right now the value looks like a pretty good match, but the final step will be to check the values again once the paint has fully dried and make sure there have been no changes. Here is the same value the next day. It appears considerably darker, so much so that it seems the value might now pass for value 5, the next step darker on the scale. It's slightly too late for this, but the comparison gives you a sense of how much you'll need to anticipate the value darkening as it dries. Grayscale Project, Part 3. Troubleshooting and an extended look at the process. In Part 3, we'll deal with the issue of paints drying darker than they originally appeared, as well as give you a deeper, longer look at how the process for completing this project should look. If you find yourself struggling, this will be a good section to return to for more help. We left off in the last video working to match value 6 and dealing with the issues of values drying darker than expected. This left us with a painted value that was no longer correct. So let's pick up with value 6. It has dried fully and it's looking a bit darker than the value I'm aiming for. I find it's a little easier to see the difference in value here with the test strip laid on top. I'm going to aim for a lighter gray this time, perhaps one that looks even a bit too light for the value I'm aiming for. This value looks just about perfect, but remember, it's going to dry a bit darker, so I'll add a little more white. It's hard to visualize exactly how light I'll need to go, because I'm not sure how much darker the mixture is going to get when it dries. In a comparison to the example grayscale, I have to admit my mixture looks much too light, but I need to start somewhere, so I'll err on the side of too light for now. So, I'll set this aside, wash out my brush, and cover the rest of my mixture with saran wrap, pressing the plastic down gently so air isn't touching the mixture. While I wait on this test swatch to dry, I can move on to working on another value. Since I don't know how long I'll be waiting, I'll transfer the black and white mixture to the next sheet of palette paper so I can keep using it. I've already mentioned that it's a good idea to skip around on the value scale as you're painting, so for the next value I'll skip up to value 8. So here's my first attempt at value 8, and it definitely looks much too dark. It looks more like a match for value 7 right now, so I'll keep adding more white. I've added more white, but the mixture has hardly changed. I need to add a little more. Okay, this mixture looks much closer. I'm going to paint this on the test strip and let it dry. Alright, it's several minutes later and it looks like value 8 is dry, so let's do another comparison. This is looking pretty good, so I'll go through my routine of comparing the values in a desaturated photo. This also looks pretty good. Then I'll slide the value up to make sure it isn't a better fit for the lighter value. Definitely not. And I'll also check it against the lower value. When I straddle my test swatch over values 7 and 8, and remember we're going for 8, which is the lighter of the two, it doesn't feel so much like a perfect match as it does like a step between the two values. I'm going to aim for a slightly lighter mixture next, but before I do, let's take a look at what that dry test swatch looks like next to its wet counterpart. There's definitely a big difference between the two. What I'm noticing is that the wet mixture looks a little lighter than the value I'm shooting for, while the dry mixture is a bit darker. After lightening the mixture just a bit, I'm painting it on the test strip again. Now that the test swatch has dried, it is looking like a very close match. So I'm going to use my phone to take a picture, desaturate it, and try to make a very close comparison of the values. This is looking like a perfect match to me. I think I'm ready to paint this on the grayscale. I'm all done with value 8, but I'll still save this mixture because I can use it as a starting point when working on either values 7 or 9. For the next value, I'll skip down to value 3. I'll speed up the process a bit, but I found that this value was fairly easy to mix. After trying only 2 different mixtures and letting them dry, I arrived at a value that worked well with the value scale. Before painting the value scale, I want to highlight the final steps I took in evaluating the correctness of my mixture. One of these was laying the dried test swatch on the values above and below value 3. Lets me be sure that I'm not missing something big. I would hate to slide this test strip up and find out that it's a better match for value 2 than 3, but I'd rather know now than after it's painted on my value scale. The final thing I did was taking a picture with my phone and desaturating it. Again, I feel like this gives me the clearest comparison between the two values without having to take into account temperature or color at all in the image. I don't think I could have gotten a better match. I'll paint this into the grayscale and save the rest of the mixture for mixing adjacent values. Finally, we're returning to value 6. This value by far gave me the most trouble in mixing. As each test swatch dried for values 3 and 8, I checked in with value 6, and I couldn't get it right. I tried and tried and tried different mixtures, and I'll spare you the hours of video footage, but I eventually landed on a value I was happy with. As you work on your own value scales, be willing to jump around. Test swatches and saran wrap will be the key to only having to paint each swatch on your grayscale once. The goal of this assignment is for you to become more sensitive to differences in value, so take your time and really spend some time looking and training your eyes to see the difference.